He opened his folder and began reading from a log. July 15th. Karen photographed our backyard from our neighbor's yard without permission. July 18th. She knocked on our door at 6:30 am demanding to see our renovation permits. July 22nd. She filed a complaint with the city claiming we were operating an unlicensed business because contractors were working on our property. With each entry, Karen felt the room's energy shift further against her, but the worst was yet to come. Yesterday, Tong continued. She hired a lawyer to try to claim ownership rights to our pool for the entire community. The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Karen wanted to defend herself, to explain the legal complexities they couldn't understand, but the words wouldn't come. Karen, Maria Santos said gently, I think you need to step down from any HOA responsibilities and maybe talk to someone about what's been happening here. Step down. Karen found her voice again, high and shaky. I'm the only one who takes community standards seriously. I'm the only one who... Who what? Asked Linda Henderson, speaking for the first time. Who terrorizes neighbors over their own property. Who calls the police with false reports. Who tries to steal someone's backyard pool. The word steal hit Karen like a physical blow. She looked around the room at faces that had once shown her at least grudging respect, now reflecting everything from pity to disgust to barely contained amusement. You're all making a mistake, she said quietly, gathering her materials with shaking hands. Someone has to maintain standards. Someone has to. But she couldn't finish the sentence. For the first time in years, Karen Whitmore didn't know what came next. As she walked to her car, she could hear the meeting continuing behind her, voices discussing harassment policies and community guidelines and restraining orders. Her phone was buzzing with notifications. Probably her daughter, who had somehow heard about the meeting and was texting increasingly frantic messages. Sitting in her driveway, Karen stared at her house, the perfectly maintained lawn, the regulation-compliant mailbox, the tasteful exterior paint in HOA-approved colors. Everything exactly as it should be, exactly as she'd worked so hard to ensure. So why did it suddenly feel like she was the one living in someone else's neighborhood? Inside, she found 17 missed calls from Jessica and a voicemail from someone claiming to be a reporter from the local news station. Apparently, videos from the community meeting were already circulating online under hashtags like #PoolKaren and #HOAliconWilt. Karen set down her phone and walked to her back window, looking out at the fence that separated her yard from the Hendersons. Tomorrow, she realized, she'd have to figure out how to explain to her granddaughter Emma that the pool party was cancelled. But tonight, for the first time in months, her mind was finally quiet. The constant buzzing anxiety about property lines and community standards had been replaced by something else, a hollow feeling she couldn't quite name, and the unsettling realization that maybe, just maybe, she'd been wrong about more than just the pool. The question now was what, if anything, she could do about it. To be continued. Karen Whitmore's morning power walk came to an abrupt halt when she spotted the Hendersons' backyard through a gap in their fence. The pool, her pool, as she'd come to think of it over the past month, was completely drained, its blue-tiled bottom gleaming mockingly in the August sun like an empty promise. Those absolute savages, she shrieked, causing Mrs. Chen from next door to drop her watering can. Karen didn't notice. Her mind was already calculating the emergency HOA meeting she'd call, the violation notices she'd draft, and the legal precedents she'd researched during her sleepless nights obsessing over property lines and easement rights. She'd been planning her granddaughter's pool party for weeks, having convinced herself, through a masterful combination of selective reading of the HOA bylaws and pure wishful thinking, that the community's shared recreational space clause somehow extended to the Hendersons' clearly private backyard pool. The fact that it sat a full 3 feet inside their property line was, in Karen's mind, a mere technicality. 20 minutes later, she stood on Tom and Linda Henderson's front porch, her iPad clutched like a shield, ready for battle. Tom answered the door in swim trunks and a confused expression. Karen, it's barely 8 a.m. How dare you drain that pool without consulting the HOA board? She interrupted, pushing past him into their foyer. I have 17 people coming to Emma's birthday party next Saturday, and half of them are children who were specifically promised pool access. Tom rubbed his temples. Karen, for the 10th time, that's our pool. On our property. We're having it resurfaced. Resurfaced? Karen's voice climbed to a pitch that made their cat flee the room. Without HOA approval? That's a structural modification requiring unanimous board consent. Linda emerged from the kitchen, coffee mug in hand, looking like she'd rather face a natural disaster than another Karen encounter. Tom, just call the police. We've been through this. The police? Karen laughed, a sound like glass breaking in a blender. They'll side with me once they see the documentation I've compiled. The community charter clearly states. It clearly states that you're not allowed on our property without permission, Tom said firmly. Which you don't have. Again. But Karen was already speed dialing on her phone. Yes, I'd like to report a property dispute and possible theft of community resources, she announced dramatically into the phone. The residents at 847 Maple Grove have illegally drained a shared recreational facility and are now refusing to restore access to paying HOA members. Tom and Linda exchanged the look of people who'd somehow found themselves trapped in someone else's fever dream. The dispatcher's voice was barely audible through the speaker. Ma'am, are you referring to a private residential swimming pool? Private? Karen's indignation could have powered a small city. Nothing is private in a planned community. That's the entire point of homeowners associations. Within an hour, Karen had transformed her dining room into a war room. Property surveys, printed emails, highlighted HOA bylaws, and a hand-drawn map of the neighborhood covered every surface. She'd even retrieved her old college ruler to measure distances on Google Earth screenshots, convinced she could prove the pool was somehow in violation of setback requirements. Her phone buzzed constantly with increasingly frantic messages from her daughter Jessica. Mom, can you please just book a community center for Emma's party? And the Hendersons are good people, please leave them alone. Karen dismissed these texts with the contempt they deserved. Jessica clearly didn't understand the principles at stake here. This wasn't about a pool party. This was about property rights, community standards, and Karen's rightful position as the neighborhood's guardian of order. When Officer Martinez arrived at her door around noon, Karen was ready with a PowerPoint presentation she prepared on her laptop. Mrs. Whitmore, I understand you filed several complaints today. Officer, thank goodness you're here. Karen gestured him toward her evidence table. I've documented a clear pattern of HOA violations and what I believe constitutes theft of community property. Officer Martinez, a patient man who dealt with HOA disputes before, examined Karen's materials with the same expression he might use to study alien hieroglyphics. Ma'am, I've also received complaints about you trespassing on the Henderson property multiple times this week. Trespassing? Karen's voice pitched higher. I'm the HOA compliance officer. It's my job to ensure community standards. Do you have documentation of that appointment? But Karen was already heading for the door, her mind racing toward the next phase of her campaign. If lawyers wouldn't help, she'd take matters into her own hands. The emergency HOA meeting she'd been threatening to call, it was time to make it happen. That evening, she sent carefully worded emails to every household in Maple Grove Estates, calling for an urgent community meeting to address the ongoing violation of shared resource agreements and the breakdown of community oversight protocols. She made sure to use her most official language, the kind that had intimidated people into compliance for years. She scheduled the meeting for the community center the following evening, knowing that most residents would feel obligated to attend anything that sounded official enough. Once she had them all gathered, she'd present her case properly, with visual aids and documented evidence. They'd have to see reason. What Karen didn't anticipate was that Tom Henderson would also be sending emails that night, warning the neighborhood about her increasingly erratic behavior and sharing copies of the police reports she'd filed. By morning, the community was buzzing with gossip, but not the kind that would support Karen's cause. The community center had never seen a crowd like this. Nearly every household in Maple Grove Estates had sent at least one representative, drawn by a mixture of curiosity, concern, and the kind of morbid fascination that compels people to slow down at car accidents. Karen arrived early with her laptop projector and 3 poster boards displaying blown-up photos of the Henderson pool, property surveys, and what she called her legal precedent matrix. She'd spent the entire day perfecting her presentation, certain that once the community saw her evidence laid out professionally, they'd rally to her cause. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice carrying the authority she'd always imagined she possessed. "Tonight, we address a fundamental threat to our community's shared values and resources." But as she clicked through her slides, something felt wrong. Instead of the nodding agreement she'd expected, she saw confused glances, suppressed smiles, and a few people openly recording her with their phones. Mrs. Patterson from the corner house was actually laughing. "As you can see," Karen continued, pointing to her property line diagram, "the Henderson pool, while technically within their surveyed boundaries, serves a community function that creates implied shared usage rights under Section 4.7 of our community charter." "Karen," interrupted Bill Morrison from the back row, "Section 4.7 is about snow removal responsibilities." A ripple of laughter spread through the crowd. Karen felt heat rising in her cheeks but pressed on. "The principle remains the same. Community benefit supersedes individual property claims." That's when Tom Henderson stood up. "I'd like to address the community," he said calmly. "This is my meeting," Karen snapped. "You can speak during the designated comment period." "Actually," said Maria Santos, the actual HOA board president, "I think we all need to hear from Tom." Tom walked to the front of the room with a folder in his hand. "6 months ago, my wife and I decided to resurface our pool. It's a major project that requires draining and refilling. Karen seemed to think this was somehow a community decision, so I've been documenting our interactions." Karen's confidence wavered for just a moment. The truth was, she'd appointed herself to the position during a board meeting where she'd been the only person present. But surely that made it official. "The board operates on implied consent," she said, rallying. "When no one objects to necessary leadership, that constitutes endorsement." Officer Martinez flipped through her printouts, pausing at a photo she'd taken of the drained pool from what was clearly inside the Hendersons' yard. "Mrs. Whitmore, when did you take this photograph?" "This morning, during my property inspection." "And you were invited onto their property for this inspection?" The question hung in the air like a sword. Karen felt the first crack in her certainty, but her pride wouldn't let her back down. Community compliance doesn't require individual permission. The HOA charter supersedes individual property preferences. "Madam, I need to inform you that you're not legally authorized to enter private property for inspections, and continuing to do so could result in charges." Karen's world tilted. This couldn't be right. She'd spent hours researching, planning, documenting. She found legal precedents from 3 different states supporting community access rights. She'd even consulted ChatGPT, which had given her a very thorough explanation of easement law that surely applied here. "Officer, I think you're misunderstanding the legal framework," she began, reaching for her tablet to show him the research she'd compiled. But Officer Martinez was already closing his notepad. "I'm going to strongly recommend that you stay off the Henderson property and cease all contact with them regarding their pool. If you have legitimate HOA concerns, those need to be addressed through proper channels." After he left, Karen stood in her war room feeling something she rarely experienced: genuine confusion. The evidence was all there, laid out in perfectly organized piles. How could everyone be so blind to what was obviously a clear-cut case of community rights violation? She picked up her phone and dialed the number for Henderson and Associates, the law firm she'd found online that specialized in HOA disputes. Time to bring in the professionals. The consultation with attorney Jennifer Walsh didn't go quite as Karen had envisioned. She'd expected validation, perhaps even admiration for her thorough documentation. Instead, she found herself across from a woman who looked increasingly concerned as Karen explained her position. "Mrs. Whitmore, let me make sure I understand," Attorney Walsh said, setting down Karen's binder of evidence. "You believe that your neighbor's private swimming pool, located entirely within their property lines, somehow falls under community ownership." Not ownership, Karen corrected impatiently. Shared access rights. The HOA bylaws clearly establish community benefit standards for all recreational facilities. But those bylaws typically refer to actual community amenities, playgrounds, clubhouses, tennis courts owned by the association, not private installations on individual lots. Karen felt her carefully constructed legal theory beginning to crumble, but she pressed on. What about the precedent I found in Williams v. Sunny Acres HOA? The court ruled that recreational facilities serving community functions were actually community property to begin with. Attorney Walsh finished gently. Mrs. Whitmore, I have to ask, have you discussed this interpretation with your HOA board? This was the question Karen had been dreading. The truth was, the board had grown increasingly resistant to her ideas over the past year. They'd stopped returning her calls after the great mailbox color controversy of last spring, when she'd tried to enforce a uniformity standard that existed primarily in her own imagination. The board lacks vision, Karen said stiffly. They're content with mediocrity when what this community needs is strong leadership. Attorney Walsh leaned forward with the expression of someone delivering bad news. I'm afraid I can't take this case. There's no legal basis for your claim, and pursuing it further could expose you to harassment charges or civil liability. Harassment. Karen's voice rose to its familiar combat pitch. I'm trying to protect community property values and ensure equal access to amenities. How is that harassment? When it involves repeatedly entering someone else's property without permission and filing false police reports. False reports. Karen stood up abruptly, grabbing her binder. Everything I've documented is factual. The pool exists, it was drained, and I was denied access. Mrs. Whitmore, please. I understand you feel strongly about this, but you need to drop this matter before it escalates further.